Welcome to the broadcast tonight. Richard Burke, the chief national political correspondent for the New York Times, sizes up the first 100 days of the Bush administration.
I do think the whole question of how much is he in control is one that is something to watch, because people, even some Republicans would tell me in these interviews, they wondered just how much he was mouthing the script.
And four distinguished writers, Arthur Miller, Nora Ephron, John Guare, and Frances FitzGerald, talk about the writers' organization called PEN.
There are just starting up reading groups around the country where people who have never met an author will read a book, works of an author, and the author will go there after a number of weeks. And it's just to show that literature is a living thing.
I think that it's rather an opportunity than a responsibility to affect the freedom of other people. A writer who's achieved some fame, if he can use that fame for a good purpose, it seems to me it's a wonderful opportunity to make it count instead of just adding to his own success.
We get together with European writers and again, lobby European governments and that kind of thing. Sometimes we go directly to the host government. Sometimes we even send missions and go to those countries ourselves and try and make a fuss, if we think that'll help.
And Tobias Schneebaum, whose book, Keep the River to Your Right, also a documentary film made about his return to the Asmat people of New Guinea.
But they were very comfortable people. I mean, I had no problems ever with them, even when I was about to leave. Yeah. There were moments that only in retrospect that I fear for my life.
Richard Burke of the New York Times on the first 100 days of the Bush administration. Four distinguished writers look at the work of PEN, and a conversation with Tobias Schneebaum about his return to New Guinea. All of that coming up.
7 out of 10 students on the web
say they're getting better grades.
Are you ready?
Virtually all internet traffic travels across the systems of one company, Cisco Systems, empowering the internet generation.
Funding for Charlie Rose is made possible by Amazon.com, your online source for everything from books, music, and toys to videos, electronics, and tools.
Brought to you by the new Toyota Prius. Part gas, part electric. Nature should definitely approve.
Charlie Rose is also made possible by these funders.
And by Bloomberg, a provider of multimedia news and information services worldwide. From our studios in New York City, this is Charlie Rose.
In the opening months of his presidency, George W. Bush has conducted a relatively smooth transition of power. He has met a few challenges along the way: the test of strength with China over the surveillance plane, criticism over the administration's handling of environmental issues, and the demonstrations in Quebec that greeted 34 leaders trying to turn the Western Hemisphere into a single market. Joining me now from Washington is Rick Burke, national political correspondent for the New York Times. I'm pleased to have him here as we consider coming up on 100 days of the Bush administration. Just give me some observations of the Bush administration at this sort of journalistic benchmark that I guess goes all the way back to the FDR.
Right, I guess we always look at the first 100 days, not that it matters in terms of actual number of days, obviously, but it does give you a sense of how well organized a presidency is at the beginning, and it does give you some clues as to how a president might behave in the future. The first 100 days of the Clinton administration, you remember, were pretty chaotic, and certainly by contrast, this president has run a very smooth operation. Whether you agree with him or not, no one can take that away from him. They were cut short by the Florida situation. They came in and assembled government very quickly, and there have been relatively few major glitches so far, and even Democrats would agree with that. I think you have to also remember, Charlie, this is a president who was pretty untested on the national stage. We hadn't had a figure like him since really Jimmy Carter, who had so little experience on a national level or running a government, and very low expectations in some quarters, and he's done reasonably well. I think it's still early to see. He's had a few tests, as you mentioned, China. He weathered that, but it's still early. They're still on script, and they haven't had that many bumps in the road yet.
How is he handling it, though? I mean, some of the assumptions going into this was, you know, that it would all be about these advisors that he'd surrounded himself with. But in the end, my guess would be that clearly he's in charge, and he is, in the sense, listening to them, but it is, after all, his administration, and he seems to be, to me, because he's got Cheney there with him, to be a man who would make his own decisions.
Right. I think ultimately he is the president. Things don't happen totally by accident. He is reliant, dependent a lot on his advisors. That's his style. It was interesting to me. I interviewed dozens of voters last week in a town south of Portland, Oregon, where it's a very swing voter area, and I asked people for their observations of the president, trying to get out of the Beltway a little bit. And, you know, I'd mention the name Bush, and, you know, in the past when I'd go to places like this, I'd mention Clinton, and you'd get people, you know, standing back, and you'd get, you know, really hard, negative, or sometimes positive answers. Same with Newt Gingrich. But this guy, it's not quite, you don't get those sorts of reactions. I mean, but one thing you do get, Charlie, is virtually everyone on their own, whether Republican, Democrats, Independents, would talk about his advisors and how he has strong people around them. And Democrats would view that as a negative. They would say to me, well, you know, he's too reliant on aides. He had to surround himself with people with more experience. But Republicans would say, you know, that shows he's secure enough to have good people around him. He knows how to pick good people. So it's all in the eye of the beholder. But I do think the whole question of how much is he in control is one that is something to watch, because people, even some Republicans would tell me in these interviews, they wondered just how much he was mouthing the script.
And you, what do you think the indication is?
I think the indication is he's always said, you know, tell me what I need to know, is his favorite line to advisors. He's never been one that's a policy wonk, as his predecessor was. But I do think he is in control, and this is just his style. I think if we want a president who's steeped in every detail, we're not going to get it with this president. But it's just a totally different approach from what we had with President Clinton.
What's the role of Karl Rove in this administration?
Karl Rove is probably the most single important person in terms of putting a certain stamp, a political stamp, on this administration. Someone like Karen Hughes, his counselor, he may be more of a confidant to she knows how he speaks, what he wants to say in speeches. He trusts her as much as anyone. But Karl Rove has a unique role of someone who has literally plotted out the early days of this administration, from the meetings with the going to the Democratic retreats to who he met with in the early days. Not only has he plotted out the early days, he's plotted out the early months of this administration. He even has a long-range planning staff that's discussing 2-3 years out. So I think he's a very important figure. I think were it not for Karl Rove, I mean, I don't think there's anyone else that you could give as much credit to for helping him get to the White House.
You wrote an article in which a piece in which you talked about California.
Right.
George W. Bush has no intention right now of going to China, or going to. I don't know whether he has intention of going to China. That's a whole other question, isn't it?
that is a whole other question.
That's a very big point,
right.
Whether he'll go to China in October. But he may go to China before he goes to California.
Right. I think that's true. That is a big surprise. I mean, he lavished attention on California during the campaign, didn't do well at all there. They thought he got trounced in California. And it's been a tradition for presidents to really make an effort there. It's a hugely, vitally important state, obviously, But this president has not, he's been to 25 other states, hasn't been to California. There's a sense that people in the White House are nervous about getting entangled in the electricity crisis. They're nervous about a lot of things in that state. They don't feel like they're welcome in that state, so they've stayed away, which may be the right thing. You could argue, though, that it hurts the party because the California Republican Party is already decimated. If they don't have him there helping rebuild the party, it doesn't do much good for the party. He's going to have to go there to start raising money because the party depends on California as a fundraising base. But it really is striking. I think Bill Clinton went there something like 8 times during his first year. I asked Karl Rove, when will the president go to California? And he said something like, I suspect he'll go there later this year. But he didn't even try to pretend that, oh, we're trying to schedule it and we just haven't.
So what does that say to you?
It says to me that they really don't see any political benefit in going to California right away. And why not concentrate on states where they won, that they want to sort of shore up the support? Why even bother with the state where they really have a lot of ground to make up? And why even bother right now? And it's when you look at the issues that he's not doing too well on certain issues. In California, his Republicans there are more pro-choice than pro-life. They're environmentalists there. I spoke to a group last week in Northern California, a very conservative group, very pro-Bush, but I was peppered with questions about his environmental positions and was he pulling back on the environment, even among conservative Republicans. So there's not a whole lot he could talk about there, at least according to many Republicans I've spoken to, many White House advisors. So there's a real nervousness right there.
Let me talk about summing up this administration. How do they view, and how do you think official Washington views, and how does the American public view his handling of China?
I think the American public, based on polling and based just on my voter interviews, I think people give him high marks for, for enduring that conflict, getting the 24 home. So I think he gets credit for that. I think it's still a little too early to say how can he conduct himself in an international crisis. I think this was just an early test case. He got through it. He got through it fine. I've heard arguments on both sides. He could have done better. He didn't finesse it as well as he could, but you can't really argue with the final outcome. So I think he's getting credit for that. I think his big problem thus far has been with the environment. Whether or not you agree with his positions, politically they haven't handled it too well. This whole arsenic question on pulling back on the arsenic standards has just made him the butt of all kinds of jokes. There are ways of doing it without looking the way he's looked. And I think they showed that during the campaign when he really knew how to was nimble in dealing with being this compassionate conservative. I've talked to several independent voters out in Oregon who said, I was beginning to like this guy. I liked how he kept normal hours and he seemed to delegate and seemed like a responsible stand-up guy. But this environmental stuff, they would tell me, has raised questions, even among independent voters, these key important voters that he's going to need for re-election, these important voters that the Republican Party needs. Even people at the White House will privately admit that they didn't handle it as well. And you saw, Charlie, in the last few days, all kinds of Christy Whitman and all kinds of administration people coming out there and trying to change their positioning a little bit and make up for their lost ground on the environment. So I think that's probably been the biggest problem thus far. But overall, you got to step back and give them credit.
All right, let me move to campaign finance reform.
Right. Well, here's another thing that usually you want your first big victory to be your own. The first big legislative victory was John McCain's in getting Senate passage of this campaign legislation. It's put the president in a box because if there ultimately is a campaign finance reform bill on his desk, if he signs it, it's giving John McCain all the more attention, all the more credit on a bill that on legislation that this president said he didn't believe in fundamentally. But if he doesn't sign it, he looks like here's the man who raised $100 million, spent $100 million in his campaign, a big money president who doesn't want to change the campaign finance system. So it's a no-win situation. There was a period when John McCain was getting more attention than the president himself. So it's put the president in a bit of a bind, and you can bet that they're not too happy at the White House with John McCain. In fact, he's been, I mean, to hear them talk, some of the president's advisors, it's like John McCain is still running for president. That's the way they view him. There's not a lot of friendliness on the part of those two.
But they might sign it anyway if it passes a House, the Senate version passes a House and comes to his desk immediately for signature, they may very well just sign it to move on.
Yeah, that's the sense, that they'll just sign it and just move on.
Yeah. They've got education coming up. The two last questions. One is the budget.
Right, right.
The administration, because of the tax cut, faces some very hard calls that you might think put it in a tough position with spending issues.
Well, the danger on all these kinds of things, if there's some symbolic cut that just makes the administration look bad, and the Democrats are already out there campaigning and talking about this president wants to take money away from conservation and money away from this and money away from that. But the danger is if the Democrats can find something that just takes hold, like this arsenic question, that just takes hold, that breaks through out in the country, that sort of labels this president as someone who's who's harsh and doesn't speak to the values of some of the voters. And that's the danger here. I think on the tax cut, so far he's not getting what he wants in the Senate. I mean, he campaigned on this $1.6 trillion cut. He's getting 1.2. No matter how that's resolved, it doesn't look like he's going to get what he wants. But one thing that I've learned is people outside the Beltway don't look at every little, move by the House or the Senate. If a major tax cut passes, even if it's not what this president wants, if education reform passes, even though if it doesn't have vouchers and some of the details this president wanted, if something passes, people will still give him credit as president if it seems to be sort of along the lines of what he proposed. He was skilled as governor of Texas in taking credit for things that didn't quite go his way.
Finally, there is this question of his cast. Has he been more conservative in the first 100 days than you might have imagined, and is he clearly done things that have solidified him with the right in American politics, or with conservatives in American politics?
Right. I don't think he's been any more conservative than we might have expected. If you looked at his positions on many of these issues during the campaign, he was never for the Kyoto Protocol and, on the environment. There are a lot of things on global warming. There are a lot of things that everyone is saying, oh my gosh, I'm surprised. But this is fundamentally a conservative guy. But what I think is different is they haven't packaged him quite as well as they did during the campaign, where it was easy to sort of cover over some of the hard right positions by coming off as a compassionate conservative. They just haven't finessed it quite as well as they did during the campaign. But in terms of his popularity among conservatives, I think it's striking. I mean, he's beloved more so than even Ronald Reagan. I mean, and another thing that Karl Rove gets credit for, because he's been the link to many of these conservative groups. They're very happy with this administration, so happy that they've given him a pass on certain things. For example, on China, I mean, some on the right would have been squawking much louder about the letters he wrote to China and so forth. He's gotten away with a lot because the conservatives have been so happy to have him there. I mean, another example is his hiring of the first openly gay person as drug czar, the first openly gay person hired in a Republican administration, I believe. You've heard very little grousing from conservatives on Capitol Hill, for instance, because they are so happy with him in general. I think there's a big sense of relief among Republicans, among conservatives, that he is in the White House. When I talk to voters, the first thing they would often say is, we're relieved, we're just relieved to have dignity back in the White House.
Well, beyond dignity, that's the point, isn't it? That he has solidified his relationships with the conservatives, so therefore he has some governing room to do things that he might want to do on these other issues.
Right, right. Starting with abortion and John Ashcroft from the very beginning.
He learned the lesson from his father, probably.
He learned a lesson from his father, not to. You gotta watch for the right. You gotta watch out for them, or work with them. But his father never was as conservative as he is. His father was never quite trusted by the right wing of the party. His son is deep down, I think everyone would agree, is just far more conservative.
Your point is it has more to do with where their natural philosophical base is rather than some smart politicking by the father or the son.
No, I really think it's both. I think it's where he is deep down ideologically, but I think it's also smart politics. I think he's learned a lot of lessons from his father, and that's one of the top ones.
Richard Burke is the chief national political correspondent for the New York Times. I'm pleased to have him. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie.
Back in a moment. Stay with us. 80 years ago, a group of writers was formed to promote literature and reading in the United States and to defend free expression around the world. Today, PEN continues to make a significant difference in the fight against illiteracy and boasts more than 2,700 members, including some of the most renowned writers in the world. Some of them join me tonight. Four of the respected members of PEN: Arthur Miller, John Guare, Nora Ephron, and Frances FitzGerald, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and president of the PEN American Center. I'm pleased to have them all here. Welcome. We do honor to PEN tonight and its honorees. First, tell me about PEN and more than what I just said. What kind of organization? How many, the chapters all over the world, et cetera?
It's an international organization. It was founded in the wake of World War I by a group of European writers who felt that after World War I, there was no more excuse for writers not to get together to defend culture against repressive regimes and narrow nationalisms. They felt that literature was a cause that went beyond political boundaries. And it's developed to the point that today there are some 90 countries have PEN centers in them. I think there are 129 centers in the world. Yeah. We're one of them, but we're the biggest, and we're here.
And beyond the fact that they're PEN centers, the mission is to do what, Nora?
The mission is to keep writers able to write whatever they want to write and keep readers able to read what they want to read. Yeah. I think that's the broadest possible way of putting it. Is that
pretty good?
The Dramatists Guild is the organization which Arthur and I are members of, which exists only to protect the copyright of the author. PEN, I think, exists primarily to ensure freedom of speech around the world. And that is still, I mean, I really loved PEN when I realized that people like Boris Soyinka in Nigeria, the great playwright, and Václav Havel in Czechoslovakia, another playwright, were imprisoned, were put in prison for their writings. And PEN got them out. PEN got them out by bringing attention to their situation, and that's, to me, I said, oh, I see, this is really, this is very, very, very important. And also, whether it's somebody like Tony Kushner, whose play Angels in America is being censored, or the school in Texas is being threatened with the removal of funds for producing this great Pulitzer Prize-winning play, and that's where PEN
It's amazing how much of that goes on that you don't know about. Occasionally, right. You see, you got a story today.
Oh, it's hilarious. There's a story in South Africa that a school board, all white, has banned a certain number of books, the writings of Nadine Gordimer, the Nobel Prize-winning playwright, and the great advocate of one of the great for the fall of apartheid. Her book July's People, which is the one.
And so this local school board just banned it?
Oh, no, not just the school, the local school, but they banned it all through all of the South Africa, the entire school area, including a couple of books by South African writers, black African writers. Because they were too introspective and too emotionally complicated. And Hamlet. And that's my favorite. Hamlet was banned because it was just too Eurocentric.
Too psychological.
It was just
Eurocentric.
Eurocentric.
That's right.
And that was my favorite. And it was banned because it was not optimistic or uplifting enough.
Yes.
And already...
We want a happy Hamlet, don't we?
And so that's,
Yes.
I mean, yes, this is what, you know, a good, well-meaning school board says we're going to protect our children through a large area in South Africa.
What about Shakespeare's comedies? Do they like them?
Oh, we don't even go into those, because there's no laughs in them, so we don't go into them, yes.
Arthur, how long have you been part of this?
Since 1960, whatever,
Yeah.
2, 3. But since you mentioned Wole Soyinka, the reason he got out of jail was as follows. They had him in a cage. There was a civil war in Nigeria. It was very vicious. And Soyinka was trying to make peace between the two sides, so he was traveling incognito between the two armies. And one of the armies, the main force in South Africa, arrested him, and he was going to get shot in 2 days. They had him in a cage. And a British businessman, I was then the president of International Pen, called me up and said, "Would you write a letter to General Gowon, G-O-W-A-N?" I said, "Who is General Gowon?" He says, "He's the head of the state."
He's the guy's going to shoot Walter.
And he says, "If you wrote him a letter, I think he would let him go." I said, "Well, why would he let him go?" He said, "I just have that feeling, and if you send it to me, I'm on my way down there now, and I'll give it to him." Which I did. 2 days later, Soyinka is out.
What was in the letter? What did you
Yeah,
say?
why was he so...
What Hallmark card did you get?
And where did you get all this power?
The general got the letter. It was signed by me. He says, "Was he married to Marilyn Monroe?" And the guy says, "Yes." He says, "Let him out."
Nora, what is the moral of this story?
He threw his arms around me and said, I was going to get shot the next day.
I'm so excited to hear that some good came of that marriage.
And then you did marry
that you were getting people out of prison before?
I had no idea.
Pitts, yes. Shoot him, yes.
That's a great story.
The point of it is that most
You may have been underutilized in your ability to influence foreign
Political prisoners
leaders.
throughout the world,
Right.
and you didn't even use that. In fact.
No, but the point of it is that all this repression takes place in the dark.
Right.
They are all usually, almost always, afraid of world opinion, whatever that is. They don't want it in the papers. And any attempt by anybody to publicize this fact is usually very instrumental in getting people free.
It doesn't work in China.
Well, the Chinese,
It
has
success,
worked in
really.
China to a degree, yeah.
Well,
but of course,
tell about Beilin, because that's a remarkable story.
Well, it is. He's actually an American citizen, Beilin, and he
Right.
went to China just on a visit, and they put him in jail. Susan Sontag, others in Penn, wrote a letter to the Chinese government. Bam, he's out. And
Did they say why they let him out? Because they realized that he was such a...
It was 2 weeks
Was it the
before-
publicity or
It
the
was the
fact that...
publicity.
The publicity. It was 2 weeks before the American-China trade agreements were going through, and they didn't want to do anything that was going to disrupt that. But Beilin had been arrested for his political writings. And without the upcoming trade talks and world opinion, I mean, the People author and Susan Sontag write in the New York Times that suddenly they said, let him go. It's not worth the trouble. As today, I mean, this thing that happened last week in South Africa, last Friday, Antia Appiah, who is the chairman of the Freedom to Write Department of Penn and teaches at Harvard, already wrote a letter to all the newspapers in South Africa about this about the censorship of Nadine Gordimer and Shakespeare.
And in fact, that was reversed because the Minister of Education apologized, and it was all turned over. So again, publicity.
One thing
made
you
the
get writers is words transcend boundaries, obviously, and secondly, writers are international figures, and so that gives them a certain prominence that others might not have.
Well,
Like
and also
filmmakers.
I think we're very lucky in this country because there are so many writers in a position to to actually reach politicians and whose profiles are high enough. I have to say, Arthur, even if you hadn't married her, my guess is the letter would have helped.
You might have let him out of the cage.
Well, but it you know.
But what about Havel? Because you worked for,
Did you have,
yeah. I used to visit him periodically when the communists were still there. And every time I visited him, for a few weeks, things were better. And then they would gradually move in again. And
mean they'd feed him better, or?
no, he was out of jail most of the time, you see. He was just living in terror all the time of being jailed.
And let me talk about two of the honorees this evening. Shala Lahiji?
Lahiji, yes.
Lahiji, tell me about her.
Well, she's an Iranian publisher. She started this company herself and published 200 titles, a lot of them by women, new writers, and so forth. She's an extraordinary energy force in Iran. And she, along with a number of other writers, went to a conference in Berlin at the Heinrich Böll Institute. And all of them were suddenly arrested when they got home because, and she was sentenced to 3 years and 6 months in jail. But why? Because she was said perfectly openly that life was made very difficult for writers in Iran by the government. And
in all of the 19 men and women charged in connection with the Berlin Conference, 10 have been sentenced to prison terms ranging from 4 to 14 years. 6 have been acquitted and 3 others awaiting verdicts, among them the renowned essayist and cleric, a name I will not, Guare.
And, right. So she's one of our honorees tonight, Barbara Goldsmith Awards, and which is a great way to sort of highlight and give publicity to people, these awards. The other one is going to be given to Mohammad Ali Mahmudov, who is a Uzbeki writer who was put in jail a few years ago for a few months and then again rearrested in 1999 and sentenced to 14 years.
Pulled out of a car when he was with his wife, and she didn't see him until later he appears in prison.
That's right, and they always sort of trumped up charges of this and that, but it's clearly, I mean, he's a very well-known writer throughout the Soviet Union before, his sin was, I think, joining a party that was opposed to the government, but it was also founded by a writer.
A couple of points to be made here. One is that does Penn lobby for their release rather than just giving them, honoring the fact that they are under persecution for human rights violations or whatever?
Penn has various strategies, and one that's often to lobby our government to do something about them while in the course of other business. Often we get together with European writers and again, lobby European governments or that kind of thing. Sometimes we go directly to the host government. Sometimes we even send missions and go to those countries ourselves and try and make a fuss, if we think that'll help.
There are also some First Amendment awards. Let me talk about a few of those. I think Dolores Wilson in Monroe, Louisiana. You know her story.
Well, she's a great story. She was a librarian, is a librarian in a high school in Louisiana who was ordered by the principal of the high school to remove 4 books, 2 about gay issues, kinds of things that
sex education.
Yeah.
Sex education,
Here are the title of the
yeah.
books: Heartbreak and Roses, Real-Life Stories of Troubled Love, Gays in and Out of the Military, Everything You Need to Know About Incest, and Everything You Need to Know About Abstinence.
Anyway, in kind of fantastic, heroic tradition, they said to her, and we want you to take every book having to do with sex out of the library. So she took the Bible out of the library and various other things. It was quite brilliant, and she won. I look forward to meeting her tonight because I want to know how it is still working there. I mean, that's an amazing thing too. She's still the librarian, yeah.
It's a made-for-TV movie waiting to be made, isn't it?
I think so.
Alberto Serrain from Miami, Florida. He's an immigrant who spent time in a Cuban jail for counter-revolutionary minors when he was a teenager in the 60s, and then he created a theater company in Little Havana.
can you imagine, they put him in jail for 3 years just in Cuba for just thinking of leaving, right? You know, somehow they knew what he was thinking. Anyway, he came to this country finally in the 70s, and he set up this theater in Miami. And all of a sudden, Miami-Dade County says, no public money, this is a sort of official statute, no public money can go to any arts group that publishes or, you know, shows work by artists who are still living in Cuba. So he said, forget that, and he went ahead and put on plays by Cuban writers living in Cuba, and his theater was shut down. He had a terrible time of it.
Let me turn to some broad themes here about the writers. Arthur, what's the responsibility of a writer beyond his work?
I don't like to think of it in terms of responsibility, because then you're telling somebody what he ought to be doing. I think that it's rather an opportunity than a responsibility to affect the freedom of other people. A writer who's achieved some fame, if he can use that fame for a good purpose, it seems to me it's a wonderful opportunity to make it count instead of just adding to his own success.
Well, it doesn't take up that much time. I mean, Penn doesn't just, you know, free people around the world like some, you know, watchdog. I mean, it's extraordinary. There's work in the prisons. There are writing in prisons. There are just starting up reading groups around the country where people who have never met an author will read a book, works of an author, and the author will go there after, you know, after a number of weeks. And it's just to show that literature is a living thing. I think it's very very self-serving for writers to work for Penn.
You know, John Cheever used to teach at Sing Sing.
He would go inside the prison and
every
teach
week.
what, creative writing, or would he teach?
Yeah, he taught writing. Sure, for years. He went there every day, every week.
When Nixon,
a real course.
During Watergate, Nixon, when they were telling him what might happen, and Nixon said, well, it's okay, because some of the best books were written in prison.
By the way, we just managed to get out of prison a woman called Flora Bravina, who was an Albanian who was put in jail. She comes from Kosovo, and she's a poet and also a pediatrician. While she was in jail, she was writing poetry with the sort of end of a match on pieces of Kleenex that were coming. She was the first Albanian out of jail once the Milosevic regime went, because Penn, Amnesty International, and so forth were on her, talking about her case. And she just came here the other day. It was thrilling to see her. And of course, she's going back to Kosovo and going to work to help children there and to write her poems.
Do you concern yourself with all the changes in publishing, worry about the changes in publishing in terms of, I mean, when you talk to Jason Epstein and people like that, they'll tell you that the revolution is coming. E-books.
I don't know about it.
You don't know anything about it, or you don't know if it's true?
I know only what I read in the paper. I am not up on the problem.
Nora?
Well, I never know what to do about worrying about these things. I never know how many minutes a day am I supposed to worry about them, and what does it mean. I always think that that the story has survived any number of prominent media, you know. I mean, I'm sure for years they said, what are we going to do when we can't write on rocks anymore? And so to me, I'm not as concerned about the
delivery system.
Yes, I mean, but I tend to think that the death of paper has been announced prematurely.
Thank you, Mark.
You know.
The Penn Literary Gala is this evening. We gather here simply because Penn does a lot of very good work, not only because it honors brave people who are suffering because of their belief in the freedom of expression, because of what they're doing, but also because they're gallant stories of what they have undergone to print and to put on plays and to create things. I'm pleased to have these creators join me for this recognition of the work of Penn.
the 1950s, Tobias Schneebaum was a respected figure in the New York City art scene. Feeling somewhat unfulfilled by the lifestyle, he left for Peru on a Fulbright scholarship in search of inspiration for his art. There, he quickly abandoned his studies and set out for a mission deep in the jungle. For a year, he would live and sleep and eat with the cannibalistic tribes he was adopted into. He continued to travel throughout his life, becoming the world's foremost expert on the Asmat people of New Guinea. His life is the basis of a new documentary called Keep the River to Your Right. And here is a look at the film's trailer.
Homosexuality business work?
Only in the south of Asmat. Every man has a male sexual partner.
Why did you do it with them?
Why not?
I am a cannibal. That four-word sentence doesn't leave my head.
Did you actually take part in the eating of the flesh?
Yes, I did.
Oh, goodness. Why do you say that?
Well, I did.
How could you?
I loved every minute of my time up until the moment we went on a raid. I didn't realize what was happening, but we went on a raid. People were screaming, running back and forth, who were being killed by my friends.
He's one of the most extraordinary people I've ever known. There was such sensitivity in him, and at the same time, such warmth, and such timidity and fear in him. He's terrified of a dead mouse, and on the other hand, he'll go into the jungle and live with cannibals.
It's a very difficult moment for me. Saying goodbye to my pit. I don't know whether I'll ever see him again. The jungle either accepts you or rejects you. Did it accept me, or did I accept it?
I am pleased to have Tobias Schneebaum on this program. You may have seen that we did this. How long we did this in this? When? 80-something?
I don't remember the year.
A long time ago. So it was about 20 years ago, 19, 20 years ago.
Probably.
The other thing is Norman is there, longtime friend of yours.
Absolutely.
You two have been friends forever.
Seems that way.
Yeah. And then you said in the end of that little piece, I'm not sure whether they accepted me or I accepted them. What's the answer to that? The jungle accepted me or I accepted the jungle?
I have no idea.
You don't?
No. I just went and I did what I wanted to do and I came out.
How did it change you?
What they taught me mostly was that I am a baby, that I have not learned anything and how to survive myself in the jungle. There's no way I could do it. Any one of them could have walked to the jungle with some kind of, not weapon, but knife to cut food or whatever. They were, well, they treated me like a child often because I couldn't use the bow and arrow.
Yeah.
And that was hilarious when when on the second visit, the 45-year later visit, they were so funny. They were like clowns in the circus. They were rolling in the aisles as they demonstrated to me how awkward I was, and I was certainly awkward. I could never pull the bowstring properly, and they were just very funny.
Now, you're how old now?
80.
80. So you were 60 when you did this, about?
20 years ago? 20 years ago.
Yeah.
1955.
So how were you when you did it?
30-something.
Yeah. And at that time, you were bored with your life and you decided you needed a change?
Well, I was bored with the art scene.
Yeah.
That really disturbed me. I couldn't make any connection with the art world at that time. Not because I was a bad painter, because there are plenty of bad painters who are famous.
Yes. You want to name a few?
No, not particularly. But I never I never cottoned to, let's say, Sol Lewitt, or
yeah, right.
There's a whole slew.
Just did a big exhibition of his work.
It's still up,
Whitney,
I think.
right.
Anyway, I had wonderful feelings for groups of people. Mainly women like Grace Hardigan,
right.
Jane Wilson, Nell Blaine. They were all people who belonged to the second generation of abstract expressionists, although they weren't necessarily abstract in their work. I mean, Jane Wilson was certainly not. Nell Blaine she painted wonderful pictures of houses, gardens, flowers, all the usual things that people paint, but she had an elegance about the way she worked that I thought was very beautiful. I'm not sure whether she's still alive or not.
You come back to New York, you've gone through this with the paint and all this stuff on. Then, 5 years ago, these young filmmakers come to see you.
Yes, about maybe 6 years ago.
They found you in the phone directory.
Yes, I find that incredible.
I do too.
But I don't know why it should be incredible. The phone book is there to be looked at.
That's what the purpose of the phone directory.
Exactly.
But we don't think of people putting their names in the phone directory. But that's the millions of names there, and that's what phone books are for. So they call you up and say, what?
They would like to meet me because they would like to do a film, a feature film, is what they wanted to do at first, with of the Harakambush people in Peru.
Now, what intrigued them about the story?
Probably the cannibalism.
Of course it was.
I hate to say it, but because, I mean, that was so small a part of my life, and yet that's what people want to hear about.
Yeah, that and the sort of...
And the sexual.
And sexual stuff, yeah.
Yeah,
that's what they love.
That's the two most important parts of the book, I suppose. But
who you sleep with and what you eat.
Exactly. So you have to be careful what you eat there.
Yeah.
But they were very comfortable people. I mean, I had no problems ever with them, even when I was about to leave.
Yeah. How do you explain that?
That I'm comfortable?
Yes. Well, yeah, that you were comfortable with these cannibals.
Well, I don't know how to explain it.
I mean, it's just that your personality was to be receptive, to be malleable.
Yes, I couldn't agree more.
Not judgmental.
Non-judgmental.
Until it got to the end where you didn't...
I was judgmental.
Then you got judgmental.
Yes.
All right, take a look at this. This is this is where you are reunited with a former lover. Roll tape. Here it is.
So he had relationships all the way along the coast. Semua laki-laki. Yeah, laki-laki dan perempuan. Men and women. I would characterize it as a love affair. He was so attractive, and to me he still is. And often I can't keep my hands off him. But that's... I know I'll have to separate, and I don't want to make that break again. It isn't easy. We've had wonderful times together. He taught me also about the, not only the sexual side of life, but also the daily life, which included going fishing, doing this and that, going to the sago fields. And it was great while it lasted.
So it was hard to leave him, huh?
It was very hard for him to leave him. I fell in love with him in spite of his the scar that he had on his lip, which was not particularly attractive, but became attractive as I spent the nights with him, night after night. And it was only... But I didn't know him very long, and I knew his family to some extent. His wife, he had 2 wives, and the thing about the Asmat people that's so interesting, or one of the things that's so interesting, was that the man had sexual relationships with a partner, a particular partner. There was not, it was not as if you could go screwing around.
That's okay. No, that's all right. Screwing around is okay.
You could go screwing around with everybody or any other male. They had a specific partner who was chosen for them when they were young, like 2 years old or 3 years old. And the men, those men who had a partner, also had a wife or 2 wives or maybe 3 wives even.
Yeah.
And the thing that interested me so much was that you could divorce your wife or your wives, but you could not divorce your partner.
It must be some history, a tradition,
well, there
a
is
reason.
a tradition because the partners have to fight for one another during warfare.
Ah.
And there was constant warfare. You could not go, if you were from the river Betch, if you lived on the Betch River, then to travel on the Islanding River was very difficult and very dangerous.
Now, was there a moment in which you feared for your own life?
There were moments that only in retrospect that I fear for my life.
Before we go any further, let me take another look. This is where you are talking about your search for inner peace in New Guinea. Roll tape.
I never thought of it as being in the natural state of man, my search. It's so pretentious to say that I was out searching for something, but I suppose I was. I wanted some kind of inner peace, and I hadn't yet found it in my 20s. I certainly didn't find it in my 30s. I didn't find it in my 40s. It was only after the age of 50 that I became aware that perhaps life was getting easier for me. Not that I had any money or anything, that had nothing to do with it. It was only that I was able to adjust to life in general. I accepted the fact that I was unattractive. I accepted the fact that I slept alone every night for years and years and years. I accepted everything as if it were natural, and indeed it is natural. It's only now, in recent years, that I understand so many people are after the same thing. I'm not sure what to call it. Inner peace is all I can say.
You look back on your life now and say, thank God I did that.
Oh, absolutely. I did. In fact, all through my life, I've done everything that I wanted to do in spite of the fact that I had no money. Don't ask me how I did that, but I did.
Well, you got a Fulbright. That's how you did the
Well, that's how
Peru.
I went to Peru.
Yeah.
And I did work for a Christmas card company.
Right.
I folded Christmas cards of all things. And when after the Christmas season, then I went off because I had money in my pocket.
All right. Here is from your book, Keep the River on Your Right. I was trying to look at where that expression comes from. Where does it come from?
It comes from the directions that they were giving me.
Oh, always keep the river on your right, you'll know where you are.
Right.
This is also from Don Juan, quoted in The Teachings of Don Juan by Carlos Castaneda. Look at every path closely and deliberately. Try it as many times as you think necessary. Then ask yourself and yourself alone one question. This question is one that only a very old man asks. My benefactor told me about it once when I was young and my blood was too vigorous for me to understand it. Now I do understand it. I will tell you what it is. Does this path have a heart? All paths are the same. They lead nowhere. They are paths going through into the bush. Through the bush or into the bush. In my own life, I can say I have traversed long, long paths, but I am not anywhere. My benefactor's question has meaning now. Does this path have a heart? If it does, the path is good. If it doesn't, it is of no use.
I don't know how I write these things sometimes.
Well, that's
some of the things that I say are so
this
true.
is an author's note, yeah. All right, listen, I should make note of the following thing. Keep the River on Your Right, a modern cannibal tale. Opened in New York on Friday, March 13th. It will open nationwide in late April. It is your life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
out of 10 students on the web
say they're getting better grades.
Are you ready?
Virtually all internet traffic travels across the systems of one company, Cisco Systems, empowering the internet generation.
Funding for Charlie Rose is made possible by Amazon.com, your online source for everything from books, music, and toys to videos, electronics, and tools.
Brought to you by the new Toyota Prius. Part gas, part electric. Nature should definitely approve.
Charlie Rose is also made possible by these funders.
And by Bloomberg, a provider of multimedia news and information services worldwide.
To order Charlie Rose program transcripts and video cassettes, call 1-800-ALL-NEWS or write to the address on your screen. Please indicate show date and guest.
This is PBS.
On the next Charlie Rose, a one-hour exclusive conversation with Robert Parker, considered the most powerful critic in the world, certainly the leading wine critic. Join us.